It's the amazing Rico Brogna podcast with your host, Evan Roberts.
Well, hi, everybody. Welcome into another brand spanking new edition of Rico Brogna. How are you all doing? Evan Roberts here. I do want to remind you, coming up Saturday at Amazing Day at Citi Field, we're going to have our first ever live hanging out with you edition of Rico Brogna at 11 a.m. at the K Corner at Citi Field. So if you have time, if you're heading to Amazing Day, we will see you there. The focus of today's pod is the Baseball Hall of Fame. On Tuesday night, the Hall of Fame will announce who's going to be inducted into the class of 2025. And there are a lot of guys who have met ties. There are a lot of guys who make you think, if they get in, how come this Met doesn't get in? So today we'll focus on the Hall of Fame. I'll give you my opinions. It's interesting with the Baseball Hall of Fame. I don't know if you guys feel this way. To me, when I think about, is a guy a Hall of Famer, I have these two checks. Checkpoint number one, now that I'm old enough where I've seen basically everybody on this ballot play. In fact, I have seen everybody on this ballot play. There's no more, hey, I didn't see him play, or I didn't see the beginning of his career, or I didn't see the prime of his career. These are guys, I guess if you're over the age of 30 or so, where you've seen all of them. I've got the eye test where without looking at numbers, just watching baseball, yes, my gut says Hall of Famer. I watched him play, felt like a Hall of Famer. And then, obviously, you look at someone's numbers, you compare that person's numbers, and a lot of times your view may not necessarily change, but the numbers don't exactly back up what you saw, right? And that's a normal thing. And then the other thing that makes the Hall of Fame such a weird kind of thing to decide on is, are we saying because this guy's a Hall of Famer, who maybe we don't think is a Hall of Famer, that makes that guy a Hall of Famer? And I want to start there because watching David Wright throughout his Met career, my view on him is pretty consistent, even looking at his numbers all these years later, which is he had a Hall of Fame trajectory. When you think about third base, when you look at other third basemen in the Hall of Fame, and then just the eye test of watching David every day and all the things he did well, I think if David Wright had a full, healthy career, I would safely say that's a Hall of Fame player. But because his career ended early and because his totality of numbers just doesn't kind of add up with a lot of the other third basemen in the Baseball Hall of Fame, my gut feeling is David Wright, I love you, just a little bit short of the Hall of Fame. And it's unfortunate because if he's healthy and he continues on the trajectory he was on, I think most of us would agree that's a Hall of Fame baseball player. So I've always felt that way. And then Scott Rowland got in. And here's the deal about Scott Rowland. Scott Rowland continued his career, unlike David, but he barely played. He played 90, 100 games a year. And the other thing I felt about Scott, while he was an incredibly great defensive third baseman, I'm not taking that away from him. And yes, I would say Scott's defense was better than David's defense. In the prime of their careers, when David was his best, when Scott was his best, I thought David Wright was every bit as good, if not better. So Rowland getting in last year made me pause on David and say, well, if he's a Hall of Famer, how is David Wright not a Hall of Famer? And I'll tell you where that also continues. Now, these guys are not Hall of Famers, but they're getting more votes than David Wright. And that would be Jimmy Rollins and Chase Utley. If you look at the prime of Chase Utley's career, because the rest of his career, he fell off. He played a bunch of years in Philadelphia, eventually going to the Dodgers, where if you look at his numbers, they dipped. He wasn't the same player he was for that 4 to 5 year prime. So again, we are penalizing David for just not being able to play. And we're going to give Chase Utley credit for being a marginal player by tacking on 5 or 6 years. Prime of Utley versus prime of David Wright is very comparable. So seeing Utley get as many votes as he's getting, he's not in yet. Right now, Chase Utley is on, let me check. He is on his second year of eligibility. Last year, he got 28.8% of the vote. Remember, you got to get to 75 to get in. But there are trends. If on the first ballot, you're at 28%, you somehow trend up usually. And by the time you get to year 6, year 7, you're probably going to get in. So as I sit here today in the middle of January, a few days before the election of 2025, I would tell you that Chase Utley is eventually going to be a Hall of Famer. That'd be my guess. And maybe I have some biases here, but was Chase Utley that much better than David Wright? Jimmy Rollins is on his 4th year of eligibility. I don't think Jimmy's ever going to get in. He's at 14.8%, but he's ahead of David Wright. David's first year on the ballot was last year, and he got to 6%. Now, luckily, he was at 6% because if you're below 5, you're taken off the ballot. And that would be unfortunate, and that would suck because I do think that over time, especially like I said, all right, Scott Rowland's in. Is that going to make other people reevaluate David's candidacy? Well, if he's off the ballot, there's no reevaluating of candidacies. But the question one has to ask themselves, because the Hall of Fame is so subjective, right? What I view as a Hall of Famer, you may not review as a Hall of Famer. What you put a premium on, I may not put a premium on. I think one of the key questions, and we're going to get into this in regards to a few other players, is do you value, I call this the Koufax test, even though Sandy Koufax was for a 5-year period, maybe the greatest of all time. So it's an exaggeration, but hear me out. The Koufax test. If you are a great player, like an elite level player for 5 years, 4 to 5 years, and that's it. And then for whatever reason, whether it's injury, whether it's ineffectiveness, whatever it is, you fall off. Is that 4 to 5 year run enough for you to be a Hall of Famer? Now, there's a few guys that you think of when it comes to that. First of all, Sandy Koufax himself. Now, Sandy walked away from the game, so there is a difference. It's not as if he started to struggle. It's not as if we saw him being effective. He walked away at the top of his game, but how many Hall of Fame seasons did Sandy Koufax have? Now, again, greatest of all time for that 4 or 5 year period. So one guy most New Yorkers think of a little bit before my time in terms of watching them in their prime is Don Mattingly. But the other one that I want to bring up is a guy who spent some time with us. And I want to pull up his numbers for you because I think when you hear his name, maybe the first reaction is, nah, no way, no way. But when you look at his sheer dominance for about let's say a 4 to 5 year period, this guy was as good as anybody. And the guy I'm talking about is Johan Santana. So Johan Santana to me is the modern day example of if you're great for 4 to 5 years, is that enough? And I bring him up because in a couple of days, one guy who will get into the Hall of Fame on the very first ballot is CC Sabathia. So in Johan's 4 to 5 years of dominance, if you take those 4 to 5 years and you take Sabathia's best 4 to 5 years, let's be frank, it's not even close. It's not. Johan Santana at his best for 4 to 5 years was better than the best of CC Sabathia. Now, CC had a much longer career. Longevity is clearly being rewarded. But think about this. One of those guys will get in on the first ballot and probably get 90% of the vote. The other guy isn't even on the ballot anymore. So let's go through these numbers. I like to look at WAR, ERA, the bold test. The bold test is when you led the league in something and where you finished in Cy Young voting. Johan Santana won 2 Cy Youngs. He had 2 other finishes in which he was 3rd and a finish where he was 5th. So in that run, he had 5 top 5 finishes in the Cy Young. 3 of them were top 3. Now, as far as CC Sabathia is concerned, CC won his 1 Cy Young. And outside of that, he had a 3rd place finish, 2 4th place finishes, and a 5th place finish. So the same exact amount of top 5 finishes. Santana had an extra Cy Young, an extra 3rd place vote. So over their sheer dominance, their best periods of time, Santana was better. CC Sabathia, and I know he led in wins. I think most of us would agree, who gives a rat's ass. The only thing CC Sabathia really led in was 1 year he led in innings pitched, which I do put a lot of value in. And he had a couple of years where he led in complete games. His highest WAR season was 6.7. And that was the year he was traded between Milwaukee and Cleveland. What he did in the 17 starts with Milwaukee is ridiculous. That I will tell you, for that period of time, there may not have been anybody better. But the highest WAR season he ever had was 6.7. Johan Santana had 4 seasons, 4, in which his WAR was better than Sabathia's highest WAR. As far as the bold test on Santana, again, we throw away wins. He led the league in ERA 3 times. He led the league in innings twice, CC once. He led the league in strikeouts 3 times. He led in ERA plus 3 times. He led in FIP 3 times. He led in WHIP 4 times. And like I mentioned, he won 2 Cy Youngs. He led in WAR 3 times. So, look, what I'm proving here, and I don't think it's very debatable, I don't think this is something that we're going to yell at each other about, is that when Santana was at his dominance, when he was at his best, he was better than CC Sabathia. And that's not a knock on CC Sabathia. CC had a great career. And I think because of the era he pitched in, like when I think of CC Sabathia, just to give you that, hey, you watched him his entire career, is he a Hall of Famer? The reason I say yes on CC, even if the top of Santana's game was better, was because in an era where the pitcher started to go down, in an era in which innings started to go down, he was the definition of a workhorse. But Johan Santana was the definition of dominance. Again, Santana at his best was better than CC's best. I think they're both Hall of Famers, quite frankly. But again, one guy is off the ballot. Johan Santana. One guy is going to get in on skates in the first ballot. Do we not see an issue with that? With a difference in that? So I do want to start there because I think that's the issue David runs into. Now, look, I'm not arguing that David Wright was ever the dominant player compared to everybody else that Johan was. In fact, the bowl test with David, he doesn't have any bowl. He didn't lead the league in anything. He was a very good player. He had some very, very good seasons. If you look at the MVP test, he had 2 top 5, or actually only 1 top 5 MVP finish. So I get that David Wright wasn't the same dominant player at the top of his game as a Johan Santana was. But for let's say a 1, 2, 3, 4, about a 5.5 year period, he was as good a third baseman as anybody in baseball. I still struggle that David Wright is a Hall of Famer, but I think the push for Roland, the votes that Utley and Rollins are getting, that's what makes me say, are we so sure about that? Because I think he should get more than what he's getting, more support than what he's getting. Because honestly, I think David Wright was better at the top of his game than Scott Rowland was. I really do. But the Santana Sabathia one is fascinating. And I wonder, as time goes by, and we have these different committees now. So just because you don't get in, on our traditional writer's ballot, doesn't mean you never get in. I think guys are reevaluated. Like I've said in the past, I think eventually Keith Hernandez is going to get into the Hall of Fame. I even think there's a point where Don Mattingly is going to get into the Hall of Fame. I think things change. I'll, again, make you a long-term prediction that at some point, and it's going to be way down the road, I think Johan Santana is going to get into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Now, he's not going to be a Met. I know that. He would go in as a Minnesota Twin, though Johan had some good years with us, and it's not just the no-hitter we're talking about. Another guy I want to mention is a guy who may get in this year, and it is going to create a complicated discussion. We actually did a Rico on this about a year ago, and that is the complicated legacy of Carlos Beltran. So we talk about the votes you get and the trends that you're at. Last year, Carlos Beltran got 57.1% of the vote. Again, not that far off from the 75%. That was only his second year of eligibility. So clearly, Carlos Beltran is trending in a way in which he's going to be a Baseball Hall of Famer. I mean, let's just get that out of the way. Whether it's this year or it's next year or it's the year after that, Carlos Beltran is going to go into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Now, as far as do I think he is, I'll tell you where the Beltran thing is kind of weird. And then we'll get into his Met legacy a little bit. Andrew Jones is somebody who, coming into this ballot, only has a few more years left of eligibility. Andrew Jones, he is at 61%, again, needs to get to 75, but he doesn't have the time. Like Beltran has so much time that I think, hey, even if he doesn't get in now or next year, he's got so much time on the ballot. He'll get to 75. I'm not as sure about Andrew Jones. So here's what's funny about Andrew Jones. And I want you guys, don't look at any numbers yet. Maybe you already are, so I apologize. But Met fans, honest answer, no numbers, and then we will look at the numbers. Is Andrew Jones a Hall of Famer? Is Carlos Beltran a Hall of Famer? And I know I'm going to get a lot of crap for this. And by the way, the numbers don't back me up, so I'm being honest. I always thought of Andrew Jones as no doubt about it. Of course he's a Hall of Famer. Like, what the hell are you talking about? And yet Beltran, I've been more on the fence about. If you compare their careers, and you compare their numbers, you do the little stat head thing. Like I have it right in front of me, and it's tough because Beltran played more games, but Beltran has Andrew Jones beat in every metric. He played about 400 more games, so about 2.5 more seasons. So the war of Beltran leading by 8, I would say, is probably a wash. Andrew probably finishes ahead if they play the same amount of games, but they didn't, so it is what it is. Beltran hasn't beat by 1 home run, so again, that's something Andrew would get if he played more games. Batting average for Carlos, 279, 254 for Andrew. On base, 350 for Beltran, 337 for Andrew. Their slugging is exactly the same, 486. So the OPSs are close, 837 for Beltran, 823 for Andrew. OPS plus 119 for Beltran, 111 for Andrew. Even though Beltran hasn't beat in basically every stat, they're very close. Very, very close numbers. But the reason I think, and obviously I loved Beltran. I mean, I was a pro Beltran guy, so anything that I say negatively about him is not associated with me not liking him. Beningo and I used to argue about it. So obviously, I love Carlos Beltran. I'm just being honest about what I saw. I always viewed Andrew Jones as a Hall of Famer and Beltran as more borderline. And I'll tell you the exact reason that cannot be measured in any of these stats. I always thought Beltran was a Gold Glove caliber center fielder. No doubt about it. He made that great catch in Houston. Who could forget it? On Towels Hill, helped them win a game. He did play very deep, which again also caused debates between me and Joe. But I always thought Beltran was a Gold Glove defensive center fielder. No question about it. Andrew Jones, for my money, and I never saw Willie. I never saw Joe DiMaggio. Never saw those guys. I did see Griffey. Andrew Jones is singly the greatest defensive outfielder I have ever seen. He did things on a baseball field. He did things in terms of getting a jump on balls. He did things with his insane throwing arm. He did things with his range. He did things by playing so shallow that they're incredible. So how much does that defense, which is very tough to measure because defensive metrics in this regard mean nothing to me. My eyes told me everything I needed to see about Andrew Jones defensively, and I saw Beltran play basically every day. How much does that insane defense and value add to his candidacy? And to me, it's a lot because Ozzie Smith, under no metric whatsoever, is a Hall of Famer, but because he was widely viewed as the wizard and the greatest defensive shortstop of all time, he got in the Hall of Fame on roller skates. Well, hold on a second. If you're going to put a guy in simply because of his glove, and the answer is, well, shortstop's a very important position. We're not going to do that with third necessarily, though you did do it with Brooks Robinson. We're not going to do it behind the play. We're not going to do it at first base with Keith Hernandez, because if you did, Keith would be in. How could you tell me you're not doing it with center field? Center field and shortstop are the two most important defensive positions. Catcher I go back and forth on, especially with the new elimination of pitch framing that's coming our way in about a year. The elimination of the stolen base, though now it's back. So the catching thing is complicated. But center field and shortstop are the two most important positions. And if Andrew Jones, if at least you agree with me that he is God's gift to defense in center field, then that should get him in. And again, his numbers with Carlos Beltran are very, very close. The bowl test, I talk about leading the league in something. Andrew Jones, and I wonder if this hurts him. I've always wondered this about Andrew Jones because I don't get how he's not in. I don't get how we're already sitting there on the 8th ballot and Andrew Jones hasn't made it. His offensive numbers are good, but I think it's his defense that puts him over the top. He had 1 year where he led the league in categories. Other than that, he was never a high average guy, never led the league in home runs or RBIs. But in 2005, he went 51-128. He finished second in the MVP voting, prime of his career, won the Gold Glove. I mean, think about that. 51 home runs, 128 RBIs. And I've always wondered, does that year hurt him? Because without any evidence, people look at that year and say, oh, he must have been a steroid guy. Now, I think that's unfair. We haven't talked about steroids yet when it comes to this ballot, because there are guys on this ballot who, if you take away the steroids, we're not having a discussion about A-Rod and Manny. They're first ballot Hall of Famers. But because of the steroid connection, they're languishing. Manny was at 32% of the vote. He's on his 9th year of eligibility. A-Rod was at 35% of the vote. He's in his fourth year of eligibility. And the odds are very low that either guy are going to get in on this writer's portion of the Hall of Fame ballot. But there's no connection to Andrew Jones. So I don't know if that's the case, but I've always wondered, because a year like that you think would help you. Finishing second in the MVP voting, the only year in which he was a top 5 MVP vote getter, I understand that. You think that would help him in a weird way. I think it actually may hurt him. Now, as far as Beltran's concerned, the bold test, as I like to say, leading the league. Beltran never did that in any category. Not once. As far as MVP voting was concerned, he had only 1 year in which he was a top 5 MVP vote getter. So very similar to Andrew Jones. One top 5, Andrew was second, Beltran was fourth. And I know there are flaws in the MVP stuff. Like, for example, I'll give you a big flaw in the MVP stuff. 2004 was one of Beltran's best years he had. He had an incredible, insane year that year. That was the year he hit 38 home runs, drove in 104 runs, over a 900 OPS. But because he was traded in the middle of the year, how's he winning an MVP? So I admit that when you look at MVP voting, that's a year in which he sort of got screwed, because if he spends the whole year in Houston or he spends the whole year in Kansas City, maybe not as much Kansas City, there's a good chance he gets votes. There's a good chance he may finish top 4, top 5. But Beltran never was the best player in baseball, was never better defensively than Andrew Jones. He never had that 51 home run year. What I look at Beltran was he was a very, very good player for a very long time. And so you look at the totality of his numbers and you see 435 career home runs, you see 300 stolen bases, you see an OPS of 837, and they're very good. But when I watched him every day, no, I didn't think of him as a Hall of Fame player. Because I think with Hall of Famers, like I mentioned with Johan, were you ever the best? And in Andrew Jones's case, in an aspect of the game, defense, he wasn't just the best. To me, he was the best I've ever seen. Now, speaking of Carlos Beltran, if indeed he gets into the Hall of Fame, no matter what my opinion is or your opinion is, and I do think he's trending in that direction. Like I said, he's at 57% of the vote, third year of eligibility. He's got to get to 75. He will get to 75. I don't know if it's going to be this year. I don't even know if it's going to be next year. But over the next 3 to 4 years, I think he's going to get in. So we're in a complicated situation, my fans. We are a franchise that for a very long time basically said we are not retiring anybody's numbers unless they are Hall of Famers. That's what we did for a very long time. That is why the only retired numbers we had were Tom Seaver as a player, Mike Piazza as a player, Gil Hodges led us to our first World Series, eventually Hall of Fame, but I think it was also the tragic nature of his death and what he did in Brooklyn. And Casey Stengel more as a tribute to what he did in New York baseball. So I think Hodges and Stengel in a weird way were the exceptions. But that was the bar that we had. Obviously, that's changed over the years. Jerry Koosman is not a Hall of Famer. Keith Hernandez may someday be a Hall of Famer, but he's not right now. Doc and Darryl are not Hall of Famers. And we have decided to retire their numbers. Carlos Beltran, if he gets to the Hall of Fame, and again, I think it's obvious he will, to me is a Met. You may try to say he's something else, but he's not. He wears a Met hat in the Hall of Fame. And if he doesn't wear a Met hat in the Hall of Fame, he's not wearing any hat. Because Kansas City, which is the closest competitor to this, because he did spend 7 years in Kansas City. Okay, so it's close in terms of how much time he spent with the Mets and how much time he spent with the Royals. And if you look at the numbers, they're also very close. The edge is the Mets. His numbers were better with the Mets, but it's close. I'll give you that. And the other thing that you would think puts him over the top with the Mets is that he actually experienced the postseason, which he didn't do in Kansas City. So it's not St. Louis. It's not Houston. It's not the Yankees or the Rangers. He would be a Met or a Royal, and I would lean towards the Mets. Are we going to have a guy in the Baseball Hall of Fame with a Met hat on, which is such a rarity, not have his number retired? I know, I'm not a big, we got to retire everybody's number, but I'm just looking at the bar here. Gary Carter is not in the Hall of Fame as a Met. he wanted to be, but clearly shouldn't be. He was an expo. And I totally get why he didn't want to go in as an expo. They're a defunct, in a lot of ways, franchise. But not only are we going to have this weird discussion of, all right, so should 15 be retired if he goes into the Hall of Fame as a Met? The Mets decided to take 15 and pass it out to everyone who would take it after Beltran left. In fact, the same year they traded him to San Francisco, Val Pascucci won number 15. Here is the complete list of people that have worn that number since Carlos Beltran was traded to San Francisco. Val Pascucci, Fred Lewis, Travis d'Arnaud, Luis Guillorme, Brian Dozier, Guillermo Heredia, Juan Lagares, Cameron Maben, Matt Reynolds, Devin Marrero, Danny Mendick, and now Tyrone Taylor. I know that doesn't matter. The Mets handed out 16 a lot, 17 a lot, 18 a lot. They did all of that for years. But it is kind of awkward. And it is kind of weird, especially if he goes in as a Met. If he doesn't go in as a Met, let's say he surprises us and he goes in as a Royal, or he doesn't go in with a logo, which is something we've seen before. I think it makes it a little bit easier to push this off. But if he goes in as a Met, he needs his day. He needs his celebration. And I think to many Met fans, they look at the era of Carlos Beltran and say, while he was good, there was some disappointment to it. There were years in which he was injured. There, of course, was the strikeout to Wainwright and 2 chokes. Not on him. I wouldn't put the chokes on Carlos. Like I mentioned before, that home run he hit against Scott not against Scott Schoenweiss, but the home run he hit before Scott Schoenweiss gave up the home runs to the Marlins was going to be a home run that sent potentially the Mets to the playoffs. It was a monstrous home run. Remember that? Game 162, 2008. So I liked Beltran. I thought he was a very good Met, but it'd be weird. It'd be weird if they do retire his number and how people would react to it. Billy Wagner. The Billy Wagner thing, I admit, my biases get in the way. I still have a tough time understanding or figuring out where we should put closers in this whole thing. You know, you think about Trevor Hoffman and you think about Mariano Rivera. And to me, those were the 2 era-defining closers. Mariano, of course, the greatest of all time. And I thought Trevor Hoffman as a regular season closer was as good as it comes. You look at Billy Wagner's numbers, though, they are great. He had himself about 7 or 8 years in which he was elite or the best closer in Major League Baseball. I think my issue with Billy, and I've pointed this out a lot over the years on the Rico, is that to me, he really contributed to what happened badly in 2006. He had a great year that year, great regular season, but he was so bad in that NLCS, giving up the home run to So Taguchi in Game 2, almost blowing Game 6, not even being used in Game 7 because Willie Randolph, rightfully so, was afraid to go to him. Tie game at home, Game 7, why was Billy Wagner not in the game? And the answer is because Willie Randolph, rightfully so, could not trust him. So is Billy Wagner a closer? 900 career innings, striking out 11.9 per 9, a career ERA of 2.31, 422 career saves, though he never led the league. But that is also, you're relying on your team. It's one of those stats where I know we make a big deal about the sheer amount of saves, but it's not his fault. Like Frankie Rodriguez has that saves record from years ago. Well, he happened to be in a lot of save situations. How many guys get that many save situations in a particular year? But so what number do you want to look at when you're talking about relievers? You want to look at WHIP? You want to look at Ks per 9? You want to look at ERA, which also could be misleading? You want to look at WAR, which is not the greatest indicator? So Billy gets in. I'm not going to cry. I do think that closers have a space in the Baseball Hall of Fame. But as a Met fan, and this is the Rico, I still have a bitterness towards Billy Wagner. I still do. Now, I want to read an email about Billy Wagner. Of course, we always take your emails to ricob@gmail.com, and we'll have a lot of Ricos over the next few days and weeks where we really try to read all of them because we got a lot, especially around the Pete Alonso stuff. This guy writes, and I didn't write down his name. I apologize. I usually copy and paste the emails onto a document. I write down who wrote this, so I apologize to this person. But he writes, I agree that Billy Wagner was the reason they lost in 2006. That being said, if you were managing all-time Mets since 1986 and could pick one closer to finish out a game, there's no one clear-cut answer. I may have to go with K-Rod because he didn't crush us with any big game losses, But this clearly isn't the right answer. Please, Evan, choose your poison. I love that question, especially in relation to talking about Billy Wagner. So I'm going to not include Jesse Orozco and Roger McDowell because I don't remember it. So it would just be me talking about history and not giving you the gut feeling of how I felt when they came into games. Same thing if I brought up Tug McGraw. So in my era, which really started in the early 90s to today, there are two guys I'm considering. I am not considering Frankie Rodriguez because while you say he's never crushed us, he never got the opportunity to crush us. The team sucked. So we don't know what he would have done in the postseason. I certainly don't blame him for the Luis Castillo game. He made the big pitch against A-Rod and was going to get out of it. And then, of course, Castillo drops it. So Frankie Rodriguez, I cannot include. But the two guys I'm actually debating are Edwin Diaz, who so far in his Met tenure, now he did blow the game in Philadelphia after Vientos hit the home run. Or I don't know, before Vientos hit the home run, I should say. Vientos tied the game after Edwin blew it. But he did have the blown save in Philly, but it was not an easy situation they were asking him to get out of. They went to Diaz in the seventh inning of the game. But he's also had a lot of big playoff moments. Think about what he did in Game 3 against Milwaukee. Think about what he did in Game 161 against Atlanta. He blows the game. Yes, horrible. We hate you. He doesn't cover first, but then he responds by getting the last 3 outs in the ninth inning. He even responded in Game 4 against the Phillies when he puts the first 2 guys on base and then gets right out of it. So he's had good moments in the postseason. He has not had yet the cut your balls off moment the way a lot of these other guys have. So I put him up there and I consider him because he hasn't broken our hearts yet. And the other guy, and maybe it's your heart grows fonder as time goes by, John Franco. Because I'll tell you this about John Franco. While he blew games for us and he blew big ones, okay, who could forget Game 6 against Atlanta in 1999? John Franco would not blow a save because the moment was too big. He'd blow a save because maybe his stuff wasn't that good. He'd blow a save because maybe his sinker wasn't sinking. But he never blew a save because of the moment. I think Billy Wagner did, and I think Armando Benitez did. I don't know if they could handle the pressure that was New York. John Franco could. So it's between Franco and Diaz, and I'd probably lean Franco. It's probably the wrong answer. But is there a right answer? Just real quick, before we wrap up this very special Hall of Fame edition of Rico Brogna, Ichiro Suzuki is without question a first ballot Hall of Famer. I don't know if he's going to get 100% of the vote. I don't really care about that anymore. Once guys like Willie Mays and Babe Ruth aren't getting first ballot, it's great that Mariano did, but whatever. He gets it. He doesn't get it. He's a Hall of Famer. I do think CC Sabathia is a Hall of Famer, like we talked about earlier. It's surprising to me or not consistent for him to be first ballot, no doubt, while Johan Santana gets knocked off the ballot. I think the other guy that you have to think about, and I'd be very curious how he does, because this is his first year on the ballot, is King Felix Hernandez. Felix Hernandez won a Cy Young. He led the league in ERA twice, led the league in WAR once. Besides his Cy Young win, he had 2 second-place finishes and a fourth-place finish. I think he's similar to Santana. I think he had more dominant years. Let me count up his dominant seasons. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's actually very similar. I think Felix and Santana are very similar. So let's see how he does. Is he going to get knocked off the first ballot right away? I hope he doesn't. I think a dominant pitcher of our era, and he was for a few years, should be strongly considered. I think the way we view pitchers should be changing. I really do. I think this is going to come down to DeGrom, too, when he's eligible for the Hall of Fame. Because I think Jake kind of fits a very similar bill to Hernandez and Santana, where he was as good as it gets, but did he do it long enough? Andrew Jones, I would put in. Look, A-Rod and Manny, not to bore you with this stuff, I'd put them in too. I think I'm over it. I think I put the steroid guys in, but clearly they're not going to get it. We'll give you some thoughts on the Rico after the results are in. We also have a lot of cool stuff coming up, including our live Amazing Day broadcast on Saturday at Citi Field at 11 a.m. from the K Corner. And we've got some other big things planned that we will keep you posted about. Any thoughts, opinions, things you want to yell at me about, of course, you can email me, thericob@gmail.com, thericob@gmail.com. Thank you very much for listening, subscribing, and downloading another edition of Rico Brogna.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Rico Brogna podcast. It's amazing, isn't it? Make sure you download it now to keep it on you at all times.